Now, a couple of things. Firstly, I'm isolated up here, so I'm going to talk to you, but you're going to talk back. Part of the rules. I'm going to ask questions, you're going to answer. Not that there is a right answer, but it encourages me. Otherwise, I sit up here like a parrot. So there's a responsibility to keep me engaged. The other thing is I sent this PowerPoint show on to my friend Dwight McKee, who's an oncologist. And I said, I'm just showing you what I'm doing. And he said, it's great, but it's a 5-day seminar. And this truly is 5 days worth of material. And so I encourage you to take the material and digest it and look at it and see it as a resource. We'll send you a PDF of the slideshow so that you can actually search on that, put it on your computer. You'll be able to then go back and look at specific sections. So look at this as a resource rather than something that is prescriptive, something that you can begin to work with and develop as you gain confidence in this area, because it is daunting. Cancer is daunting. And everything here is referenced. So please, if you find something of interest, go to the references and check on those in regard to further research to encourage you. There will be, there was supposed to be, will be sent to you a PDF of blood tests to do. And those are important because we'll look at it as we go through the seminar, but they are important to be able to objectively measure the factors that give rise to the cancer terrain. Theoretically, everybody gets cancer. Theoretically, we have these microtumors of 1 million cells, which is the size of the head of a pin, too small to measure. And these develop spontaneously mutations, particular factors, and they are then generally, when they get to be that size, become unstable. Macrophages come along, they go through apoptosis, and they are recycled by the spleen into usable material. However, to move from that 1 million cells to a tumor requires a number of factors, and that's not just the tumor, it's the terrain in which that tumor exists, the body. And this is what I think is so important, and I think this is one of the things that oncology does not focus on appropriately. I think there is more and more people in the field, in biomedical research, that are looking at cancer terrain, looking at these kinds of pathways. But this is something that we need to pay more attention to, because it is not just the tumor itself, but are the pathways that give rise to these factors. What increases angiogenesis? What interrupts cell adhesion molecule, cell-to-cell communication, which is so critical? What causes the shift from endothelial to mesenchymal transition, so that the tumor then becomes metastasized? So the initiation, the progression, and metastases are 3 separate developments, and so we want to look at that. So we'll send you this. I expected it had been ready, but it isn't, so we'll send you that so you get a look at that. So my background is in Chinese medicine, but I practice what would be called contemporary Chinese medicine as opposed to traditional, based on those traditional facts, but in itself different. Most of it is based on research. Most of it is looked at in regard to pharmacokinetics, looking at systems biology as opposed to pulse and tongue diagnosis and some of the more subjective things. It is a science. It's a science that is every bit as valid as medical science or biomedical science. But it's a different approach. Biomedical science is a top-down approach, going back to the Age of Enlightenment, where we believed that we could understand the world by taking it apart. And then we would induce, by inductive reasoning, understand the nature of things by looking at its component parts. That's a top-down approach. The other scientific approach is bottom-up, that we look at the system. We look at the relationship of the parts to each other and the complexity that exists. And this bottom-up approach is called systems biology, and Chinese medicine is a systems biology medicine. And this is, again, a developing field, the whole field of omics. We'll look at that. So again, I'm not going to read all these slides. I leave that to you to look at as we go along. I will sometimes just dip in there. But this is just some of the research that has been done on Chinese medicine and cancer. Interesting, the Chinese have been using integrative oncology now since the 50s. At Guangdong Men Hospital, where I work, they are staffed by herbalists and oncologists, and they work together developing new treatment protocols for people. And here's again looking at genomics, metabolomics, proteomics, and all of these omics, which are part of the whole basis of modern Chinese medicine. Science is built up with facts, as a house with stones. But a collection of facts is no more a science than a heap of stones is a house. And again, this reflects the concept of a bottom-up approach. A lot of stones or bricks doesn't make a house. Lots of research on genetics does not make a science. Those are things in which you have taken them apart. We want to look at the whole. Interesting research that's happened in the last 60 years, looking at the amount of information on PubMed. I often, when I talk to oncologists, they're getting better these days, but in the past 10, 15, 20 years ago, they say, well, there's no research. And at that point, there wasn't a lot. When they say that now, I say, well, you haven't done a good search on PubMed, where there are thousands of research articles. They will counter by saying, well, yes, but they're not randomized, double-blind, controlled trials. Well, that may be a fact. And if you're willing to give me $100 million, I'm quite happy to go and proceed with some of those kinds of tests. We have many tests. Some of them are in vivo, some in vitro, some in human trials, various degrees of integrity in those trials. But it is a science, and there is research on these things. This is the mesh search. So again, if you are a researcher, you know how to use a mesh search in PubMed. Bioactive, this is again just, I like these little pictures because they give me a sense of how the implications of these things. And this is looking at the bioactive components within these things. Again, and this is again part of it is like we do blood testing, and I do measure blood, and then I treat, and we then measure again. If you have more resources, you can do circulating tumor cells. There's some Germans who are doing some really good work with circulating tumor cells. If you've got more money, you can even test against those circulating tumor cells. But this starts at about $1,000 and goes up to $10,000. When I often tell patients, and I try to say it as gently as I can, cancer is the most expensive disease you can get. And if you have a spare $100,000 to treat yourself with, your survival rate will be superior. Because you can go and get these tests done. You can go and get hyperthermia. You can go and get low-dose chemotherapy. You can do a lot of things that you can't do in a regular medical system. It's not covered by insurance. So it is an expensive thing. Again, we're looking at the subjective things, how a person feels. This is really critically important. You know, it's an interesting fact that people who have good social support survive longer. They have survival time is better. Their Karnofsky scores are better. They stay in remission longer. They survive. And if cancer is just some cellular disease, why does socialization, affection, love, caring, and engagement make such a significant difference? It's not like a virus. It's not like something you catch. I tell patients, you didn't get cancer, you are cancer. And once you have cancer, you will always have cancer. Doesn't matter, you'll die of something else perhaps. and particularly with prostate cancer, which is overtreated. I'm working with was approached by Professor Stricker in Sydney, and he is a surgeon, and he does prostates, and he, according to one of my sources, he's made himself $100 million over the years, and he is world famous, and he whips them out all the time without even needing. For example, if somebody has a Gleason score of 9 or 10, it makes no survival difference to take the prostate out. None at all. No significant change in your survival rate. But they take them out. Why? I don't mean to be cynical. However, $100 million. Now, maybe they're exaggerating, but his fee is $20,000 a pop, and he probably does 10 of those a week. So it's not time to be cynical about it, but you have to recognize also that oncologists are the only doctors who are paid to prescribe a medicine. The average oncologist in the US makes $5 million a year. That's the average, because they get paid to prescribe. When I talk to them and I say, we could do low-dose chemotherapy, we need to add something like berberine, we're going to enhance the efficacy of that. And they go, why would I do that? Well, because it's better for the patient. Yeah, well, so I don't want to be cynical. Traditional herbal medicines, of which Chinese medicine is part of it, Persian, Tibetan, Indian, Ayurvedic. And this is just some studies that were involved in RCTs, orally administrating, were included in the review. So there are these tests, and quite a good series of tests. Breast cancer and prostate cancer are over-treated, by and large. They're treated too aggressively. And if you look at statistics, they look fantastic. They say, look, our survival time is better. Well, most of the tumors that are being diagnosed today are DCIS, ductal carcinoma in situ, which isn't really even cancer. It's a lesion. If you take that DCIS and you wait 6 months, half of them will be gone. They don't need treatment. Half of them will disappear. But what they are doing now is they're treating them, doing lumpectomies, they're doing chemotherapy and radiotherapy when something isn't even a cancer. I had a patient who was taking tamoxifen. And I said, okay, it's ER positive. What's the rate? 10%. 10%, and you're doing tamoxifen? This is just madness. But again, it's like the braces and suspenders and belt sort of theory that oncologists use. If something works, then do it twice. This is from a book. I don't know where the person got the statistics, but it's interesting to look at the increase in cancer incidence. Now, some of it is statistically having to do with early diagnostic treatment. Death rate is pretty much the same over 10 years. And again, if you take away some of the subjective things like DCIS and remove that from the equation, and you look at invasive breast cancer, you're going to see the survival rate hasn't changed in 100 years. And treatment that is integrative, that's how we pronounce it in Australia, is better survival rate. And again, these are statistically proven, and research backs those things up. Overdiagnosis, again, as I've said, it's of course against interpretation. Susan Sontag wrote a book back in the 70s, I believe, and talked about how terrifying cancer is, the equivalent of tuberculosis in the 19th century. It terrifies everybody, and people are they get you have to sit down now. You have cancer. This kind of pall comes over people. But we're going to do something for you. We're going to take care of you. Oh, there's the hope. Now, all you have to do is suffer all of these things. And What's my survival rate? Well, survival rate at 5 years is good. Probably you did nothing, survival rate at 5 years would be good. Number of cases, early stage breast cancer detected. Screening mammography has only marginally reduced the rate at which women present with advanced cancers. So all of this diagnosis is not only a waste of time and money, but also is dangerous. This is a pathology. They can't even agree on pathology, and you're looking at individual policy interpretations of the various kinds of rates of underinterpretation or overinterpretation. Pathologists generally agree upon interpretation of invasive carcinoma samples. Their interpretations for precancerous lesions may be more variable. It's the same, again, the rush to treat is understandable if you are terrified. And people are terrified. Physical activity. Again, if doing nothing else but taking walks will reduce, will keep the person in remission. It will slow cancer growth. Just exercise will do that. Now, exercise is easier for women because they get benefit from walking. Men get no benefit from walking at all. It's a waste of time. We need 5 hours minimum a week of intense exercise, both cardiovascular and weight bearing. 5 hours minimum a week of intense exercise. That is minimal to preserve your health. And it doesn't get easier when you get older, I tell you. I complain about that a lot. No one listens to me. You're listening to me. Previously sedentary postmenopausal women can adhere to a moderate to vigorous intensity exercise program, results in changes in estradiol and sex hormone binding globulation, sex hormone binding globulation concentrations that are consistent with lower risk. So exercises changes the profile, and we're going to look at some of the tests that can be done on that. Prevention. Women who are under 22, under 23 BMI have lower incidence of cancer. Cancer is associated with visceral adiposity. And we're living in a world of overnutrition. People eat too much. So any diet that cuts down on your kilojoules is a good diet. People ask me, patients, they say, what diet should I have? I say, no one's shown any diet is better than another. The Gerson diet, the ketogenic diet, veganism, all of these things may be helpful. But what is the diet that patient needs today? And then what are they going to need next week? And they need to get back in touch with their intuition. And the only way to do that is eat less, because then your body will give you a real sense of what it is you need. So getting in touch with it. I had a patient come in who was probably about my height, about 176 centimeters, and he weighed 50 kilos. I weigh 75 kilos. And he was on this ketogenic diet. And he read somewhere that this is the diet. He had no lean muscle. It was just bone and skin, tissue. I said, the diet is killing you, not the cancer. He said, oh, but I read somewhere that if you take this diet, you're going to cure cancer. Yeah, but you're going to die anyway. You know, look, there's nothing left. You need to eat something. So again, people eat out of concept rather than out of what is truly needed for that person. Larry Dossey, I don't know if he's still around. He was back in the 80s. He wrote a bunch of books, and he wrote a book on, he said, somebody asked him, what's the best diet for cancer? He said, the one you're not eating. Overweight and insufficient physical activity is associated with all of these diseases, and all of them result in the long term in death. You know, the average, I don't know what it is in the US, but certainly where I saw a study, the average 70-year-old in Great Britain takes 3 different pharmaceutical drugs on a daily basis. And by the time they're late 70s, they're taking 5 or 6. The drugs are killing them because they're taking drugs to overcome the side effect of other drugs. Don't get me started on PPIs, on statins, all of these things, absolutely unnecessary. So again, and health, people come, it's like your fitness in your 40s determines your fitness in your 70s. So people think, oh, I'll get to it later. I'll start exercising later. There won't be a later. Hyperglycemia associated with reduced overall survival rate in cancer, incident of breast cancer in Western world runs parallel to major components of insulin resistance syndrome. So again, people say, what caused cancer? I don't know. But we have some pretty clear ideas of what's involved in the mechanism. When somebody knows why they get cancer, they're going to get a Nobel Prize. I've had 40-year-old vegan yoga teachers with breast cancer. I don't know. They don't, they are thin, they're fit, they eat well, they're healthy. They get cancer. And then you get people who are 90, hitting the scotch every day, smoking cigars, don't move at all. They don't get cancer. So we don't know. Is it genetic? 10% maybe. Maybe 10%. Breast cancer, 65 to 75% ER positive, 20% are HER2 new, 15-20% are triple negative. Mutations in 20-25% of breast cancers, hereditary breast cancers. 5% metastatic when discovered. 20 to 30% of patients with early breast cancer will experience relapse with distant metastatic disease. 20 to 30% will have a relapse. Patients with local reoccurrence, 75 to 90th will develop a distant metastasis with extremely low 5-year survival rate. Chinese medicine adopts an overall therapeutic approach to treat and prevent reoccurrence of metastases, to improve the immune system of patients and to strengthen the body's resistance. People talk about the immune system. They say, oh, well, I'm going to enhance my immune system. Well, which one? And he said, what do you mean, which one? They said, well, which part of your immune system? It's like they read it somewhere on the internet. Dr. Google. There you go. Do you know that, for example, and we'll get to this later, everybody knows that you should take selenium when you've got prostate cancer, right? Isn't that the kind of general myth? It works if you're deficient. If you have adequate levels of selenium, it will cause this to metastasize. You do not take supplements unless you need them. Well, if a little is good, more is better. When in fact, that may be dangerous. Okay, some more studies, important herb for drug development. The traditional Chinese, well, I speak a lot in China. I'm sort of the resident Guelo, and I'm supposed to laugh here. Yeah, they troop me out, so, and I speak English, and they don't understand what I'm talking about, and they look at the slides, and they don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm the white guy in the room, okay? And, but, one of the things I'm finding in more and more is that they're looking for patentable drugs based on Chinese medicine. Transhui. Toad venom is now in I think, phase 2 trials, and they're looking at turning that into an FDA drug. So, toad venom. Yeah. Yeah. It's toxic. But it's a natural form of chemotherapy, and they're developing drugs out of it. And it actually works pretty well. You can get it as an injectable. There's massive amounts of Chinese medicines that are available as injectables. And again, particularly in stage 3 and stage 4 cancer, where a person's gone through radiotherapy, chemotherapy, and their digestive system is just shot. Them taking oral supplements is almost a waste of time. It's like pouring things into a sieve. It just doesn't stay in the body. I was working with a woman in one of our hospitals who was using curcumin. And she was with older patients, 70 or above. And she's saying, it just come out in their stools. Just no metabolism at all. And then, of course, the secondary thing is if it does get into the bloodstream, then the liver detoxifies it almost immediately, and there's none that's left in the serum. Curcumin, on average, is only about 3% bioavailable. Now, I make one that is heat solubilized and then mixed with turmeric oil and phosphatidylcholine as a way of making it more absorbable. So again, here's where technology is coming in. Again, another thing about Chinese medicine is traditionally you only had, in all kinds of natural medicines, you only had water or ethanol as solvents. Today we've got a dozen different kinds. And each of those creates a different fraction that is appropriate for different treatments. Supercritical, methanol, a variety of these kinds of solvents really make a significant difference in terms of the application of these medicines. Oh, this is just some historical things. You know, traditionally, they only were able to diagnose cancer when it was in its final stages. So when they look at some of the factors they're talking about in these things, the patterns there, they're only talking about cancer that is in its stage 3 or stage 4. But they do talk about things like toxins, heat toxin, blood stasis, phlegm damp. Now, all of these things, again, when you talk to an oncologist, you say, oh, the breast cancer is caused by phlegm. And they sort of look at you and they go, yep, okay. And it's amazing how many Chinese medicine practitioners use a language that is inappropriate. This is the paradigm we live in. We live in a biomedical world. You have to use a language of biomedicine. The observations are correct. We know that most cancers are associated with high degrees of coagulation. We know that there are toxins in the body that cause chronic inflammatory states. These are measurable. So the observations from the ancient masters was absolutely spot on. Their diagnostic procedure was more intuitive than objective. But now we can objectively look at these sort of things. And so that's what I do a lot of, is translate this into a modern idiom in which it can be spoken without corrupting the original intention of the medicines in terms of the diagnosis. When we talk about phlegm damp, now there's one that's hard. What is phlegm damp? Anybody here do Chinese medicine? Okay, what's phlegm damp? How can damp cause breast cancer?
Something intangible.
Sorry?
Something intangible.
Well, to get into that territory there, I'm sure there are factors that are intangible. But we live within a scientific community. So like saying qi, you know, qi is this invisible energy that nobody can measure. It doesn't make any sense. If you can't measure something, how do you know it exists? Now, I'm not talking about just top-down reductionism here. I also try to understand it. I believe, for example, qi is not a thing. It's not some kind of vital energy circulating through invisible channels. Qi is a capacity. Qi is a capacity to adapt, to change, to grow, to evolve. When one is qi deficient, one has a paucity, a lack of capacity to actually change. So we'll look at some of that. When we talk about phlegm, what we're talking about is interstitial fluid, lymphatic fluids. We're talking about cell adhesion molecule. We're looking at, cells communicate with each other. And in cancer, that communication system breaks down. What we have then is hypoxia, and hypoxia creates toxicity, and this creates congealing. Tumors have a positive interstitial pressure. So if you look at it rationally, you can see that there are reasonable explanations for a lot of these concepts, and that we need to be able to modernize the medicine so we can communicate. So theory of TCM coupled with laboratory studies and safety information can serve as a basis for design of more definitive trials. And yes, and that's what they're doing in China. And we're doing it slowly in the West. And you know, when I began practicing 40 years ago, this was alternative medicine. And it was some sort of voodoo superstition. And there'd be a few doctors who would be interested, but they really wouldn't going to touch it. In the last 15 years, it's changed dramatically. And I'm now speaking with people in China who have major funding, who are going to start integrative hospitals in China, India, in the Western Pacific. And they're going to be hospitals that are able to treat the whole range of these diseases in an integrative fashion. We see this already happening in Germany. Some of the best clinics are in Germany around treating cancer. They do low-dose chemotherapy at 2 o'clock in the morning with hyperthermia. Get the core temperature up to 40, 41 degrees, and they're getting brilliant results with this. They're doing local hyperthermia for prostate cancer. You know, there's a man in New York, and we have one in Australia, that you don't need biopsies anymore. He has radiographic equipment that measures tumor activity. And they're specifically developed by a man in New York who trained this man in Australia. So you don't even do biopsies anymore. You can measure these things, then you can treat them without surgery, without chemotherapy, or low-dose chemotherapy, or combinations of chemotherapy and natural substances. Don't like the word natural very much. Because if something is natural, then something is unnatural. And how does that make somebody who does unnatural medicine feel? So I generally think either everything is natural that humans produce, or none of it is natural. Now, animals use natural medicine. They go out in the woods and they chew on some bark or eat some grass or something like that, dig up a root. Once you start manipulating a plant by cultivating it, by boiling it, by shredding it, by shaping it in one way or another, extracting things, it's no longer natural medicine. It's semi-synthetic. So again, I think, we grew up with this illusion of natural medicine. Natural medicine is so wonderful. And it's a great concept, but it is prejudicial. I do natural medicine. And you obviously don't. Okay, that's another way to get real cooperation from medical doctors. Doctors aren't bad people, and as I said, it's changing. They really are. Professor Stricker called me up. He wants to work with me. He's made his money. He has his yacht. He's got his Rolls Royce. He wants to do something now that's more interesting and more challenging. Sure, happy to come along. So they're beginning now to come to people like myself. It's happening, and it really is an important time to be able to create a new future for cancer treatment. Patterns in Chinese medicine, they talk about liver. Liver is, when they talk about liver, they're not talking about the organ of the liver or the liver meridian. What they're talking about is a particular pattern. And liver is often associated with feelings of frustration, powerlessness, emotional constipation. When you're stuck in traffic, you are feeling liver constraint, liver qi constraint. If you get up and move, the constraint moves. Kidney deficiency. What are they talking about the kidney? It has nothing to do with the kidney. It doesn't even have anything to do with the adrenals. It has to do with the hypothalamus or the pituitary. And these are the things that are at the control of this. You take a standard TCM formula like Liu AD11, which is for kidney yin deficiency, and you look at its the pharmacokinetics, and it all impacts the pituitary. And it also impacts the sympathetic nervous system. So these things, you can, when you look at what a plant does and what it's made of, you can see what it does. Then you can match it with its historical use. Qi, stagnation, and phlegm. When you are not moving, you get stagnation. You get accumulation. Phlegm, heat, liver qi, stagnation, blood qi deficiency. These are all historical terms that have relevance, and we just simply need to translate that into a modern language. DCIS, these are some of the patterns associated with that. Reported incidence. Women use complementary medicines with breast cancer. And I always tell my patients, you must tell your oncologist you're coming to see me. And they don't want to do that. And I say, you have to. You have to. I will talk to the oncologist. I'll tell them if they're interested. I'll tell them what I'm doing. I'll give them the research on it, why it's being done, what the implications are, what the dangers are, that there are no antioxidants in this kind of substance. These are the things you can do. This is the historical reason. This is the dynamics of the plant. This is what is being done. And some of them say, okay. Some of them go, no, absolutely not. And I say, well, you have a choice then. You either respect your oncologist, and I'll work around that. We will do the herbs at a time away from the chemotherapy or radiotherapy. We can work around that, or find a different oncologist. But don't lie to the oncologist, because that just sets up really bad habits in terms of treatment. I have patients come in, they've got lists 2 or 3 pages long. They've been to the homeopath, the naturopath, the herbalist, the Western herbalist, the what are the, you know, what do you call those people? Kinesiologists, yes. And they've got all these medicines. And I say, you know, it's like, do you eat? You know, it's like, and they're getting digestive. It's like, you know, take 90% of that away. You know, theoretically, EGCG is helpful for prostate cancer. Okay? It might be helpful. You can see that certain kinds of substance, curcumin, for example, is helpful in some kinds of treatments. But it's not the primary treatment. It's secondary. You're not going to get those kind of results just with those substances or vitamins or minerals. They're helpful if they're needed, but they are not a primary treatment protocol. You have to work around that person's condition, part of their needs that go with that. So, green tea. I can't remember the, you know. Again, these are just some studies. There's lots of studies on the combination of using biomedical oncology and Chinese medicine or complementary medicine, and they all show they're pretty effective. And there's a study that was done in 2004, indicated that 50% of breast cancer patients are considered Chinese herbal medicine effective in treating cancer. And we get really these results a lot. I'm now getting well enough known in Australia, and slowly here as well, that oncologists, they say, oh, seeing Daniel Weber, they say, okay, that's fine, just, you know, he knows what he's doing. He's not going to go crazy on you. And then they come and they got really great results. And he says, keep on doing what you're doing, but don't tell me what it is. And therefore, they absolve themselves of any responsibility. If they knew what it was, then it would be, technically, they would be approving of it. So there is this kind of relationship. Yeah?
Well, I'm wondering, you know, say, with the statement that says usage of some way ginseng among women with breast cancer, you know, blah, blah. So, are we talking about that
No, these are just, this was a survey of women. I'm not talking about treatment. I'm just saying these are the things that are used historically or repeatedly. I think this particular study was, one of them was done in Korea.
Do we know anything about
Sorry.
that, though? Do we know anything about that? I mean, so many of these studies don't differentiate between types of breast cancer.
I do, and that's what we're going to do, is we're going to look at the various types of breast cancer and the treatments that are appropriate to that. Absolutely. So I'm just giving you background information here. So just softening you up. So you're going to get, in about 10 minutes, you're going to go, I don't know what he's talking about. He's just wandering around like that. I'm going to stop listening. I'm just going to let it, just let it in. It's all right. Again, some just historical. Again, this is really quite critical. Breast cancer is a local manifestation of a whole body disease. Where the tumor shows up and the nature of the tumor is dependent on secondary factors. Cancer is a whole body disease. Microenvironment and these cancer stem cells I mentioned before are regulated by complex interactions of components in the tumor microenvironment. Again, we look at treating the tumor microenvironment because this, one thing about, again, in diagnosis, a tumor is pretty much walled off from the rest of the body, particularly in these early stages, stage 1, stage 2 cancer. People who have early stage cancer are actually quite healthy. And it's remarkable. You see people come in, stage 2 cancer, and they're healthy. They're fit, they run, they exercise, they eat well, they're healthy. And in some way, this tumor is sealed itself off from the body. And therefore, treating it becomes more difficult because you can't get into the tumor. Tumors develop multi-drug resistance. They will develop multi-drug resistance to complementary medicines as well, to herbal botanical medicines as well. Adipose tissue, again, body weight. A low BMI, 20, 21, that's a good weight. Waist-hip ratio is really important. A man's waist should be 0.9 to hips of 1. Women is 0.8 to 1. This is the right dimension. Anything above that is disease-provoking. And coming back to that, I was saying earlier about the immune system. And this isn't really what we're going to look at in this too much. We'll just in passing. But cancer has often deficiencies of cell-mediated immunity and higher levels of humoral immunity. So when I come back to that and somebody says, I'm going to stimulate my immune system, you want to use those products that stimulate cell-mediated immunity, which is what is associated with cancer. High levels of cell-mediated immunity are found in rheumatoid arthritis and low humoral immunity. The substances that bring up, and they are this yin-yang, so when one goes up, the other goes down. Medical mushrooms, astragalus, these both increase cell-mediated immunity. Obesity, again, this is really what we're looking at. We want to get in stage, in early stages of cancer. This is what you want to avoid. You want to look at that, and there are things very specific that we can do to prevent metastases. No, the only cancers that you die of directly of the tumor are brain and lung. All other cancers, it is metastases that kills the patient. Nobody dies of a tumor. And again, cytokines. We measure cytokines, inflammatory cytokines, tumor necrosis factor, chemokines, interleukin 1, interleukin 6. Cancer stem cells and their effect are really, we don't know if they are stem cells themselves that have mutated or cells in the tumor that have taken stem-like qualities onto them. But certainly, this is the failure of almost all medicine, particularly chemotherapy, is that you can kill 95% of a tumor. What remains are cancer stem cells. These are immortal, and they now have developed a resistance. Tumors learn. They're evolving organisms. They're not smart in the sense that the host is killed by their behavior, but they are surviving, developing ways to promote their growth. Interleukin-6, these are some of the formulation that is used if you're measuring some of these inflammatory cytokines. This is a formulation that was used, prostaglandin E2, interleukin-6, and NF-kappa B. Another formulation for the inflammatory cytokines, Scutellaria bicolensis, Wong Lien, Coptis chinensis, Wong Bai philodendron. All of these herbs are what are called bitter and cold in Chinese medicine. They're detoxifying, and therefore they are applicable to those kinds of cancers that are initiated by chronic inflammatory states. Chronic inflammatory state is, I think, the precursor to almost all cancer. And there are a number of factors that produce this. Pollution produces this. Bad diet produces that. These inflammatory cytokines and chemokines. Stress produces it. You get stressed enough, the body produces inflammatory cytokines. So stress is associated with cancer initiation and development as well. So you look at these sort of things, and you can see these substances and their impact on these specific cytokines. Emodin is a isolate. I use a lot of isolates. Isolates are technically the active compound in a herb. A herb may have 2% or 3% of an active component in it, and it is isolated out, and we use then the pure thing. The reason I use these is traditional medicines was based on wild gathering, wild crafting. And a plant developed secondary metabolites, which is the medicinal component. The primary metabolites are the things that the plant needs for its survival, and it is the thing that herbivores take in for their nutrition. So when we eat carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, those are the primary metabolites of a plant. The secondary metabolites are toxic. They're the medicines. Why does a plant produce secondary metabolites? Protect itself from herbivores. They taste bad, they make you sick, you eat them, alkaloids in the food. They have all kinds of unpleasantness about them. So when you don't have a wild-crafted plant, when you cultivate a plant, you take away its stressor. Even if it's organic, it has much less secondary metabolites. And we can't use wildcrafting. There's just too many people on the planet to go out and pull things. Already there are plants that are on the CITES list. You know, CITES? I can't remember what the acronym stands for. Council on Endangered Species or something like that. And it looks at animals and plants. And you can't use those plants that are on that. They're forbidden to be used in manufacture. So we find substitutes for that. So that's why I use isolate. Long story short answer is I'm making up for the loss of the integrity of the plant because it is no longer wild-crafted. But I use whole plants as well. Berberine is an isolate that I use repeatedly. I use it for everything. It is better at regulating blood sugar than metformin. It downregulates all kinds of inflammatory factors. It downregulates CYP3A4, which is the enzyme that breaks down chemotherapy, makes chemotherapy more effective. And I proposed that at a convention in China. I said, let's use 80% of the chemotherapy dose and use it with berberine. We're going to get a better result. So I think they're trying to look at some of these things where we can actually reduce the amount of chemotherapy and get a better result by supplementing it with complementary products. Treatments. Okay, let's start with this. This is basically the pathways that we're looking at. And these are done in terms of, and you can look at the reference here and go to the references in the back and take a look at some of those research. Okay, again, this is just the pharmacology in terms of the medicine. Triple negative breast cancer. Estrogen receptor negative, progesterone receptor negative, human embryonic growth factor HER2 new negative. It amounts to 10 to 17% of all breast cancer. It is considered the most dangerous because there are no secondary treatments. There's no tamoxifen, aromatase inhibitors, Herceptin, or any of these things that can be taken. And often, particularly if it is found in younger women, and this is commonly found in women under the age of 45, it is much more aggressive because it is much dependent upon inflammatory factors, highly aggressive in its nature. Average age for breast cancer is over 70. Average age is over 70. And like many things that you get at age 70, you might die of something else. Certainly prostate cancer would be in that category. More aggressive, and they have distant metastasize, triple commonly used chemotherapy, are limited due to the acquired drug resistance and toxicities. They become multi-drug resistance very quickly. Results that suggest that triple negative breast cancer associated with 6 DNA repair non-synonymous single nucleotide polymorphisms. Now, when we talk about polymorphisms, we're talking about the same thing that Chinese medicine was talking about when they talked about pattern. A polymorphism is just a unique epigenetic expression. It is epigenetics that are the issue, not genetics. And how a gene is expressed is dependent on its environment. Your internal environment, how in touch you are with yourself, your own spiritual realities, your own intimacy of your own social relationships, the food you eat, the exercise you do. That's how genes are expressed. And these things that we call pattern, or zheng in Chinese, are just polymorphisms. Now they can be measured. And this is exciting. One of the things I hope to do when they start these hospitals is I want to do very specific testing of either tissue samples or blood samples against compounds. So when they do a biopsy, if they're going to do a biopsy, or they do a lumpectomy, I want to be able to measure that tissue. And we can do that in real time. And within 24 hours, we know how to treat this person. And this is simple. We have the technology today. Nobody does it. It's the same reason I asked them, why don't you tell me how active? You know, prostate cancer is all technically androgen receptor positive. Technically. So, but I say, well, but you're not telling me how much it is. Well, we don't have to. Well, you do with breast cancer. I know, but that's different. Okay, I don't, well, okay. And tell me what the Gleason score is. It's 7. Well, okay, what is that made up of? Is that 3 and 4? 2 and 5? Well, it's the first number that counts. If the first number is lower than the second number, it's not aggressive. You treat it differently. Now again, this is just common sense when you're treating cancers. Okay. Betulinic acid is from a number of plants. It's quite common in there. This is the research I did and was published just last year. Exhibit a variety of biological medicinal properties: antibacterial, antimalarial, inflammatory, anti-cancer. We looked at these triple negative cell lines, and we also looked at the anti-inflammatory and anti-angiogenic potential, which we looked at because I grew these cell lines on healthy tissue and looked at the inflammatory response that occurs. You know, tumors promote their growth by releasing inflammatory factors and co-opting healthy tissues. Cancers co-opt and gather healthy tissues to support their growth. And this is done by inflammatories, as well as by hypoxia. So I did this study and we found they'd be very effective. Treatment of the cell line could lead to inhibition of DNA synthesis, causing arrest of cells in the G2 phase, eventually restrain the proliferation of cells. Working in these low dosage, expression of these P21, P27 lowered the expression of P27 and CDK6, only BET-A treatment. Co-cultured with stromal cells, lowered expression of P21, 27, and cyclin-1. So again, this was a simple in vitro study I did at Tianjin University. I did this for my second doctorate, which I'm getting this year. It cost me $50,000 to run this experiment. Just running cells in a dish. So you can see how expensive research is. And when people say, well, there's no research, well, who's funding it? And they're cutting back on all the funding. You know, pharmaceutical companies spend more money on marketing than they do on research. All right, enough editorial. Well, I'm not in Oklahoma, am I? I went there once. I'm not going to go there again. You know, it's nice to be here. It's civilized. You know, Denver is a civilized place. It is. It's pleasant to be here. Sorry?
All the Okies love it. If they go anywhere else, if they're working as hard as they can to get back, I don't understand it.
Anyway, I did this research. It came out very well. I'm looking at doing some in vivo with this research because we use 3 substances, betaluinic acid, I'm sorry, gone blank, terecaxicum, and some other substances. And we had troubles with solvency, so we want to use them with animals, and I think we'll get some good results with that. But again, it's just a matter of sitting down and writing a 100-page proposal for funding. So, anybody ever do one of those things? No, God. Just your whole life is eaten up by these things. Cor consists of Yanhuso, Corydalis, and Rhizoma curcuma. And it is an archaic prescription. It goes back to the Song Dynasty. First recorded in these volumes. Both Yanhuso and Uju could inhibit cell proliferation, induces cancer cell apoptosis, where Yanhuso inhibited metastases. Extracted by a 95% ethanol, a ratio of 3:2. This was a really good study for the treatment of triple-negative breast cancer, combination of those things. Corydalis, again, an isolate found in Yanhuso, has an effect on metastases, limits metastases because it stops the EMT, endothelial mesenchymal transition. Cells have to change their structure to escape into the bloodstream. When they do that, they become mesenchymal. Then they have to change themselves back again. And you can interrupt that process anywhere along the way. So I believe fully that the prevention of metastases is one of the easiest ways of treating cancer. Really, it's quite simple and straightforward. And as I said before, you can measure circulating tumor cells. As I said, Professor Pachman in Germany does a brilliant job. And as I said before, it's about $1,000. But you can do that and you can see the tumor load in the fluid of the body. You can treat and 6 months later measure again and see a reduction in that. Then you're stopping metastases. Only about 1 out of 1 million cells that is in the bloodstream, cancer cells, actually finds a way of getting a niche where it can become activated in the body. Yeah?
What do you know about the Greek circulating tumor cells test? There's a lab in Greece.
Yeah, Jonas, I met him. Yeah, I prefer the Germans, just because they're German.
What's the name of the doctor? You Patton?
Pachman, Pachman. I believe it's not as casting aspersions on the Greeks. I believe that the Germans are more accurate. There's less false positives. I've heard some of the people say that the test, I can't remember, RGCT or whatever is.
RGCC.
GCC, yeah. I've heard that there are false positives in his testing. Now, that's only somebody told me that, so I don't know for sure. But I met both of them, and I really respect Professor Pachman. I believe she has invented or discovered a great number of these kinds of protocols and is getting very accurate readings on that. Can't remember what her company is called. Again, looking at some of these things in choroidalis and aromatase activity, Ganoderma, again working with triple negative breast cancer cell lines, was demonstrated for a cell cycle arrest. Ganoderma lucidum suppresses the evasive behavior of breast cancer by inhibiting the growth of this breast cancer cell line. Another isolate coming from Strobilanthes and its effect on the caspase 8 and 9 and the intrinsic and extrinsic signaling pathways associated with that. Sharia, again, a compound from Chinese herb, Ju Huang, a potent tyrose kinase inhibiting and anti-tumor activities. Triple negative breast cancer, 50 cases of postoperative given a formulation JLB-SHJ. Control consisting took chemotherapy, 5-year observing. Survival rate in the control group was 80%. The treated group was 94%. Life quality and all of the other factors were much better in the treated group. Total recurrence rate, the control group 76%, treated group 26%. Bone marrow inhibition rate, control group 90%, treated group 10%. And this again is some more studies on this formulation on triple negative breast cancer cell lines. This is the formula. It's an interesting thing. Astragali shawansa is not the root but the seed, and it is bitter and cold and detoxifying in its nature. And it's used a lot in cancer. So again, this is a pretty standard kind of formula that you could have made up out of granules by a number of different, or if you want, in the early days when I started practicing, we used to give people a pot. And we'd take them, they would get this pot, this beautiful pot. And then we give them this formula. I had to write in Chinese because the Chinese didn't understand pinyin back in the 70s. So only the young ones knew. The old ones, so I had to learn in my little chicken child scrawling, and they would look at it and they would laugh. They go, oh. Anyway, the patient was impressed. They got this thing they couldn't read, and they take it to the herbal shop, and then all the drawers are there, and none of them are labeled. And they're pulling things on, and they get this thing, and it's beautiful. And they go home and they cure their pot because you got to soak it and then you got to heat it up slowly so you don't crack it. And then they put it in the pot and they boil it up and they burn it. Or the husband comes home or the wife comes home and says, "What is that terrible smell? God, Jesus, I'm leaving." So compliance rate was about 10%, I think. And Dr. Xu, who was from Taiwan, and he started a company, Brion, out of Japan and Taiwan. He was one of the first people to do granules back in the 70s. He was a brilliant researcher. He was like a couple of PhDs in his name, and I met him back in '79. I was really impressed, and he translated an enormous amount of material from the Chinese and Japanese on herbal medicines. I still have all of his journals. They're like 120 journals that he published. Unfortunately, he died about 15 years ago. So this is a formulation. It's an interesting thing here. Aconite, prepared aconite. Aconite is hot in terms of Chinese medicine. And it balances some of these very cold medicinals. And this is, again, one of the Chinese herbal medicine, and I'm sure Ayurvedic medicine as well, is like cooking. It's just getting the right balance, and you get something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And there is a synthesis that occurs in formulations that doesn't happen with individuals. So, as I said before, I use isolates a lot, but I also use whole herb formulas in combination with that. So you get the best of both. Here's another study on triple-negative breast cancer, reoccurrence of metastases, prolonged survival time, and life quality, Karnofsky score. This is the formulation that's used, again, in this sort of formulation, Longqi, used quite a lot in cancer formulations. Erju, again, Erju breaks up blood stasis in the Chinese terminology, and it is also an effective, when I'm measuring, and when you look at these blood tests, you're going to look at hypercoagulation. We're going to look at some of the factors associated with thrombin time, fibrogen, D-dimer, and all of those things are critical to telling me how active this tumor is. Estrogen, progesterone receptor. How are we doing? Okay, let's just stop for a minute. Yeah.
Is there a difference between those two formulas that you provided?
Look, I think what you're going to find here is that you're going to find this one is, here we go to this one. This one is a milder formulation. It still has the aconite, and it has the cortex cinnamon, ruguay in it here. But these factors, there's more of a tonifying property here. Looking at this formulation, you're getting things that are much more dispersing in their nature. So we were talking about accumulation factors. A lot of these formulations are based on some kind of intuitive pattern. Now, medicine has to be a science. Yes, has to be a science. Has to be based on reason and understanding. Now, there's a thing called pure science, mathematics and physics. Pure science is unequivocal in its approach. Speed of light is the speed of light until we discover that it isn't. It's universal. You know, the structure of an atom, and, or a molecule, these things are hard wired, they are objective, and we're clear in that. Applied science, like medicine or architecture, is the artful application of science. Anybody can design a building if you are an engineer. You know, it's just, you need to know what the load bearing of that wall is and what you're going to put across the top of it. Does that make you an architect? No, it makes you an engineer. A good architect takes the raw material and transforms it into something inspiring. That's what a good physician does. Takes the raw material of science and through intuition and communication creates something quite beautiful and transformative in the patient. I always spend at least an hour and a half with my initial patient. I want to get to know them. I want to know about their story. I want to know about how their lives, what they're doing. I don't know about their disease. I get their reports beforehand. I ask for all the medical reports, and I preview them before coming in. So I take a half an hour. So that 2 hours I spent with this patient. But I want them to feel inspired by the time they leave. I want them to feel that they can change the outcome. Because their oncologist has said often, well, you've got 3 months to live. Nothing we can do for you. Now, technically that may be true. Statistically that may be true. But people aren't statistics. How many of you are better than average drivers? Most people, yes. So, anyway, in looking at this, partly is to know the individual herbs and then to see the properties of what they're doing and see the fact that this is much more dispersive and aggressive in its treatment. So we're going to go back to that. But just before I go on to this, and we're going to take a break in maybe 10, 15 minutes, I want you to talk to me for a minute. How is all this going? We've gone through 61 slides. And we've just started touching on it. Yeah?
This might be premature, but I was curious about dosage and also when you're using it with chemotherapy, either with chemotherapy or without, and how you adjust, and just in a general sense.
Most of that information would be on our website.
Okay. Right.
And if it isn't, just contact us. We're happy to work with practitioners and do that. And again, part of it is experimental. Because the individual patients, what is their capacity. If somebody's extremely weak, you can't use some of those formulas. They're too aggressive. You need to build them up. You need to tonify the qi in the traditional term, which means we need to encourage this person's capacity. And some of that is the medicine, and some of it is the communication. Getting them to understand there are choices involved here. Working with chemotherapy, again, some of that's already written down. Some of it is a part of the experimental process. Most of this is tested against certain kind of chemotherapy substances. So that's in the literature as well. Any other, coming back to this thing, how are you doing? What are you learning? You're not falling asleep yet, so talk to me. You can't leave unless you talk to me.
So when you're tonifying chi, and we have this perception of learn, when you tonify, say if it is an excess of cellular growth and proliferation, you tonify chi, are you going to make things worse before they get better? Should we be communicating to our patients possibilities of that, or will the body know what to do in reducing that?
Well, if somebody comes in who's severely depleted, they're losing weight, they're losing lean muscle, they're fatigued. We deal with the presenting issue first. Yes, they have cancer, and yes, there is probably a whole raft of secondary factors associated with that. But until they begin to recover, and where you begin is the gut. Stomach and spleen in Chinese medicine is basically just a metaphor from your mouth to your anus. And the capacity of that digestive system to take nutrients, and you can look at the small intestine, you can see where all of these nutrients come in. And you can then treat accordingly with various kinds of herbs. And when we talk about, for example, I talked about kidney yin and kidney yang. What is the, if you have kidney yang deficiency, what is the key herb that is used to overcome kidney yang deficiency? Sorry? No. No. That's a good tonifying herb.
Ginseng?
No. That's a general qi. Sorry? No. Futsa. Futsa. Why? Because it's hot. And how does futsa work? It upregulates the thermal function of the hypothalamus. So when somebody is cold, feels cold, they're feeling old, they have what's called cockroach diarrhea, they have runny diarrhea, their digestive system is weak, they feel chilled, they have no energy, they sit, like you see old people sitting wrapped up in a blanket, even in summertime. This is kidney yang deficiency. You need then to change the hypothalamus. Nothing to do with the kidney, nothing even to do with the adrenals. So what we see in these things are very specific pathways of treatment. Any other comments, questions, observations? Yes?
I just was curious, you mentioned the measurement of circulating tumor cells by, is that Bachman or something?
Pachman, yeah.
Is that available in the United States?
I don't know if there's a distributor here. What you can do is, I'll remember, I'll get their website, and basically you just take a blood sample and you airship it over there, and if it gets there in 3 days, they can measure the circulating tumor cells.
And that would be probably the best pre and post after the treatment regimen? Is that what it's doing?
Yeah, it's a very good way, but then there are other tests that are cheaper, and again, it depends on the resource a person has.
Overall, I will respond that things are going great.
Okay.
That was your first question.
Thank you.
Except that once in a while you fumble.
Ah, yes.
But I would ask then, when you talk about those remaining stem cells,
Yeah.
how well do you think the circulating tumor cell tests are also giving us information about the leftover stem cells?
Not. Okay. They're a different measurement. Cancer stem cells, a stem cell exists in a niche in an organ. And stem cells are therefore a repair mechanism. So if you damage an organ, these stem cells are activated to repair. And then they become quiescent. They go into retreat and they're quiet again. Cancer stem cells, whether they are original stem cells or distorted cancer cells themselves, they don't become quiescent. However, if you can control the quantity, keep the quantity down, and therefore you can use things like chemotherapy to a degree, you can use botanicals and you can control the quantity of those. Yes?
I want to go back to a statement you made about phlegm dampness. You know, there's a lot of discussion because in Western medicine about blood and blood thinning and all of that sort of rheology. Do you think that that phlegm dampness is really just a lot of expressions, functional expressions of a rheology of the non-blood fluids?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, when you look at the tumor environment, the microenvironment, and you can measure the metabolites coming off of a tumor that are shedding itself into the interstitial fluids, this is a marker of phlegm dampness. So there are people measuring these things in research. And again, cell adhesion molecule is associated with phlegm. Hypoxic inducible factor alpha is associated with phlegm damp. So there is this whole area in rheology that is associated with those issues. Let's just start a little bit of this, and we're going to have a break. The liver is cited as biosynthesis for estrogen and is the biotransformative. Estrone is the equilibrium with estradiol and B17 hydroxysteroid, 17B HESC. With respect, the estrogen is taken up by the liver, and there will be biotransformed through different metabolites. And this is important to measure these metabolites. It is not estrogen that's the issue, just like testosterone is not the issue. Men get prostate cancer because they are low in testosterone. And they're high in DHT, which is aggressive. So all you need to do is give them testosterone and block the conversion and by affecting 5-ethyl reductase. Same thing with estrogen. So here we're looking at some of the background factors. I'll let you look at this in your own time. And looking at the CYP19 aromatase and expression of proactive enzymes. Here are 2,4-hydroxy derivatives, estrone and estradiol, and their metabolites undergo sulfation and glucuronidation. Estrone and estradiol sulfates could be conjugated by these other factors. Again, looking at the 2:16 ratio is an important one to look at. The 4-OHE1 may react negatively with damaged DNA. Metabolic pathways, and this is one of the things you want to measure, and you can. There are a number of clinics that do this. I use a particular one on the East Coast because it's simple. They just take a saliva sample and you send it off. You get results within a week. And some more studies on the physiological estradiol per se, causally carcinogenic by proliferative process. This is your pathway. Looking down here and the way in which all of these things are affected as they go down. The metabolites shown in red, carcinogenic metabolites are shown in red, and anti-carcinogenic or neutral metabolites are shown in green. So when you do these tests, you can get a reading on all of these metabolites, which is really quite an important one. The most common one you see is the 2:16 ratio. And if this one is very high and this is low, then you have, again, a carcinogenic environment. These are the estrogen test. That's their website. And we're looking at these phase 1 detoxification. They recommend, when in their association, they recommend things like DIM, 3-indole carbonate, and so forth like that. I did some research in China and found some of these substances that convert these metabolites and the cascade that occurs. Panexea ginseng here is affecting treatment, had an inhibitory effect on messenger RNA. Rhizome curcuma had increase in induced enzymic activity. Chrysanthi, lychee, Rhizomus salvia, Mittelrotzia, etc. All of these are inducers of CYP3A4. And when you induce this particular enzyme, you activate a detoxification pathway. And who should be tested? This is from their website. Most any woman should be tested at least once to see what that metabolite, that pathway is. And certainly women with estrogen receptor positive breast cancer need to know and verify that they have multiple SNPs and add estrogen metabolism improvement techniques to their standard breast cancer treatment protocol. ER versus alpha versus beta. I'm gonna take a break here pretty soon. But this is, again, one of the simplistic approaches. When you talk to an oncologist, they often say you can't take phytoestrogens because if a person's got ER positive breast cancer, it's going to make that's nonsense. There are two receptors. You've got an alpha receptor and a beta receptor. The alpha receptor is the one that causes the cancer. The beta receptor downregulates the alpha receptor and is anti-tumorigenic. Phytoestrogen activates the beta receptor. Simple, straightforward. And we'll look at that research as we go along. So why don't we take a break, have a tea or a coffee, and then come back.
We have till 11:15. Great. There's some snacks out here for everybody.